Hello everyone, today we are going through the process of making my drawing Lolita Wave. The idea behind this drawing, Lolita fashion and Vaporwave or Millennium aesthetic are sort of my two favorite visual styles, favorite fashion styles. They really don't go together at all under any circumstances. So I decided that I was going to combine them, throw them together, and see how they ended up. The original drawing I did for this, I did at a convention on some mediocre paper with a really bad eraser. So the original sketch that you see that I'm working off of is just very rough, and I ultimately was not thrilled with the way that it ended up looking. So Lolita, for people who might not know, is a Japanese street style that rose to prominence in the late 1980s and through the 90s. It's heavily inspired by French Rococo and Victorian fashions, but through sort of an exaggerated lens. It's those styles, but more would be a good way of describing it. Some common substyles of Lolita would be classic, which is very much just an exaggerated form of Rococo and Victorian styles. Lots of florals, sort of the same kind of colors that you would see in those fashions. Sweet, which has more pastel colors and brighter colors, and often has motifs of animals, cute little animals, and dessert foods, jewelry, fashion, makeup. Those sort of motifs are often really found in Sweet Lolita. And the print designs are sort of reminiscent of illustration styles that you might find in the late 50s, early 60s. Gothic Lolita, which is much more dark. The colors tend to be closer to blacks and dark blues and purples and reds. It uses a lot of Christian imagery. And it's sort of something that you could consider like a cathedral, but as a person. So if a Gothic cathedral was a human being, that is what Gothic Lolita would look like. Another style that's really important to talk about in reference to this particular drawing would be Punk Lolita, which sort of takes some of the aesthetics and materials that would have been used in the 1970s UK punk scene. So a lot of tartans, red tartans, black colors, leather, metal, chains, that sort of thing, and incorporates them into a much more exaggerated feminine style. As far as this drawing is concerned, I definitely wanted to stick more towards my biggest concern was sticking to the Lolita shape, the shape of Lolita fashion, which has a very bell shape, very wide skirts coming to about knee length, maybe slightly above the knee, maybe slightly below the knee, but that is pretty much the shape of it. And so because vaporwave fashion tends to be pretty modern and pretty, I guess, bare bones in a way, I tried to keep everything, the main Lolita aesthetic being the shape and cut of some of the materials. So like I said, the original drawing was pretty rough. Mostly just at this point, you'll see that I sort of adjust, I definitely adjust things as I go, things that I don't feel like necessarily work with either the Vaporwave style or the Lolita style. This Coord ended up being, what I designed ended up being very busy. It's an aesthetic that I ultimately ended up really liking. So what I really drew from Punk Lolita for this would be the asymmetrical elements to the dress and to the skirt. The fundamental thing that I wanted to incorporate from Lolita to keep this, I guess the best word would be coordinate, to keep this coordinate reading as a Lolita style would be the shape of the skirt. Lolita usually uses bell skirts, so very sort of tapered to the waist and then comes out in a long, large bell shape. Usually there are big underskirts or petticoats underneath. To get it to fundamentally read as Lolita, I wanted to keep that skirt as it was. The skirt that shape. And the skirt, it varies between like just above the knee, at the knee, below the knee, but usually in that general shape. Vaporwave is definitely more of an aesthetic as opposed to Lolita, which is more of a fashion style. I also like to call it, I've never heard anyone else call it this, but I like to call it millennial futurism. So, retrofuturism is the aesthetics of like the 60s, 50s and 60s idea of the future. So something that would look like the Jetsons and Forbidden Planet, like what we would consider a very retro style of futurism. Whereas millennial futurism draws on the aesthetics of the late 90s and early 2000s, and the 80s as well to some extent, for its idea of the future, or its idea of futurism. It's a lot of early computer graphics, early internet graphics, mixed with classicalism. In Vaporwave, you'll see a lot of the use of early computer graphics. You'll see a lot of use of like early window screens, of Greek statues, early video game consoles, like mid to late 90s era video game consoles. Vaporwave involves a lot of like very bright colors. It's very bright colors, but in a very particular palette, I would say, which tends to go more towards blues and pinks and teals with splashes of other colors. There are reds that come in, there are oranges and yellows that come in as well, but those are more used as sort of an accent to the more traditional futurist Vaporwave palette. This was an interesting exercise because while Lolita and Vaporwave are both aesthetics that are heavily inspired by the past and by looking at history and looking at past aesthetics, they're inspired by wildly different sort of past eras. So you're looking at something that's like from the previous turn of the century, so the like 1800s, 1900s, versus the most recent turn of the century, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. Just in that way, there's not a whole lot of overlap, or there hasn't been a whole lot of overlap historically. So going into this, the sketch that I used was very sort of chaotic, if only because there were elements that I just couldn't erase, because I didn't have access to an eraser. So I was definitely concerned about how it was going to come together, and whether or not it was going to end up with a look that, 1, read as Vaporwave, 2, read as Lolita, and 3, was coherent with itself, and read as something that was aesthetically pleasing. Ultimately, I guess you'll see the finished product at the end of this, and you'll be able to decide for yourself whether or not you think that this is a successful attempt. Let's see, just cleaning some stuff up here. So for this, I didn't really want to do lines. Obviously, you're seeing I'm just sort of putting in color, laying down color, which is a blessing and a curse, because I tend to use lines to mask rougher color choices and rougher color placements and shapes. I figured I could probably give a decent amount of detail without line, and ultimately I think I did. I achieved the level of detail that I wanted to, but working with lineless art is always just a little bit more difficult for me. As well, Clip Studio Paint, I do really enjoy Clip Studio Paint. I think it's a really good program, especially for, like, scenery illustration. If you want to do something that is in perspective, they have a really great perspective tool. But I grew up using Photoshop. I used Photoshop since I was, like, in middle school. So I'm very used to the way that it functions. And I didn't start using Clip Studio until I was in college. So it's not necessarily, I'm not as used to it. It feels awkward to me a little bit. The way I sort of think about it is it feels very gooey, whereas as Photoshop feels very, very firm. And I'm not necessarily, the gooiness isn't necessarily bad, it's just not something I'm used to. As far as Vaporwave fashion is concerned, it tends to be, at least what I've sort of looked into of it, it tends to be much more like street fashion style than Lolita. Lolita is obviously a street fashion, but it is generally quite a bit more formal, as opposed to Vaporwave, which tends to manifest in more like joggers and t-shirts and jackets and hats and face masks and tennis shoes and those sort of aesthetics, which definitely, depending on the Lolita community that you would discuss, are sort of fashion elements that would not necessarily be welcome in Lolita. Had a lot of trouble with the skirt here, or with specifically the grid on the skirt. Again, that's something where it needs to be in a perspective, and I was just having trouble. At first, I wanted it to be sort of more going along with the curvature of the skirt. Ultimately, I decided that to stick to the aesthetic more strictly, I would just have it be a grid disappearing into the distance in perspective. So this is just me sort of messing around, trying to figure out how to make this grid work on the skirt, put it in perspective, get a little peek behind the curtain at all of the cheats that I use to try and make things look not like ass. Oh, so these tights gave me a lot of trouble because what I wanted to do was have that stripe element going in opposite directions on each leg. And just with the second leg, I was having a lot of trouble sort of figuring out where the lines would be in a way where they both are consistent and also are not creating tangents. This style that I ended up going with is definitely sort of a patchwork of different imagery that is often associated with vaporwave and synthwave and these sorts of aesthetics. If I were to do something like this again, so do more Lolita chords in this more experimental millennial futurist style, I would be interested in doing something where I would create a coordinate specific to one aesthetic element. So I would do one chord that is inspired by the sort of Arizona can with the watercolor cherry blossoms on it. And I do one that is more like the grid with the lots of neon and palm trees and more tropical looking. Or I do one that is inspired more by like early CG and the Roman and Greek statues, or one that is inspired by early computers and early like Windows and AOL. And I'd definitely be interested in doing that. I ended up having a lot of fun sort of trying to get everything to go together. I'm also very proud of how these cherry blossoms turned out. And you can really see the sort of the smoothness and the liquidity of Clip Studio in those elements, because I think I either used the watercolor brushes or the oil brushes for those. And they ended up being incredibly just smooth and liquid and gooey. I'm sorry if you hate the word gooey, but that's just the best word I can think of to describe Clip Studio. I've definitely been interested in Lolita fashion since I was in middle school, in the mid-2000s. Probably mostly comes from the sort of cheesy how to draw books that I got back at that time. It's not something I necessarily explored other than thinking, oh, that's a really fun and nice aesthetic, fun and nice look, until the past year or so. Really thanks to YouTube. The people I watch tend to be... So there are definitely two YouTubers that have influenced my interest in Lolita fashion. That would be Lovely Lore and Tyler Willis, otherwise known as Scarfing Scarves. They're both Sweet Lolitas, which is interesting because Sweet Lolita is actually the sub-style that I'm least drawn to, just because it just doesn't necessarily reflect my own personal interests or aesthetics. But they're both just really entertaining, really... I think I got onto it... I saw one of Lovely Lore's Lolita reacts to some Lolita documentary. And I really love documentaries and people discussing documentaries and discussing the way that things are depicted. Just in here, I'm gonna get really distracted. I got really distracted working on this. Necktie. It's sort of like a pixelated style. And I kind of became momentarily obsessed with making all the squares as like neat and perfect as possible. So I'm gonna get a little caught up in that for a minute. Anyway, I became interested in Lovely Lore because I was recommended one of her Lolita Reacts videos. And it was the first one she did, which was from a YouTube channel called Barcroft TV, which does like these little mini documentaries about different people. So I watched that video, and then I watched a bunch of the Barcroft documentaries, and one of the documentaries was about a woman whose style was described as like gory Lolita, or I don't even know, like pastel goth. And then I was recommended another video from a different Lolita. It was from Tyler Willis. Last Week Lolita News, which is sort of a semi-parody of Last Week Tonight and just its own little news show. And I was recommended that, which was about the same person who was in the documentary. And that's fun, because everybody loves a good drama. And it was about how the person depicted in the documentary had gone on this really bizarre, racist tirade. And she was just very funny. She has a very dry sense of humor, very snarky, very sarcastic. And so I gravitated towards that. And so between watching the two of them, I sort of became re-interested in Lolita fashion. Lolita was definitely something, like, there are a lot of different sub-styles and alternative fashions that I've been moderately interested in the past, but not really fully explored to any extent. Lolita was definitely something like Lolita and J-fashion and steampunk and those sort of aesthetics, cyberpunk, retrofuturism. Vaporwave I just sort of became interested in. I think I was introduced to it through, of all things, Simpson Wave. Like, there was a video about Simpson Wave, and then through that I found different videos about different music genres, and I was definitely introduced to Vaporwave as a music genre as opposed to a visual style. And the music genre is sort of the child of chiptune and elevator music, if that makes any sense. It's very surreal. Whenever I listen to Vaporwave music, it always just zones me out and makes me feel like I'm in a fucking trance. But it's very airy. There's a lot of, like, early or more primitive synths. There's a lot of sampling. Oh god, there's just so much sampling. Sampling, especially of 80s music. I'm also very interested in dead malls and sort of videos about dead malls. And so I definitely got more of an exposure to Vaporwave through dead mall videos, because Vaporwave sounds like haunted mall music, pretty much. Mall music from hell. So there's been a lot of Vaporwave music that plays in dead mall exploration videos. The aesthetic of dead malls and sort of mall soft and mall deco are also looks that I'd like to explore, or aesthetics that I'd like to explore more in art. I'm not sure necessarily how I would do that. Definitely not really maybe not in a fashion sense sort of way. More of in like an architecture or concept art style. Concept art is, theoretically, it's what I got my degree in, or it's what I specialize in. Definitely focus more, in the past couple of years, have focused more on the character design and character concepting aspects of concept art. But I would like to explore doing more of exploring this sort of aesthetic more in architecture and in scenery and in scenic concepting. The painting of the face, this isn't necessarily how I would go about painting normally. So normally for art that I do, just like the general day-to-day, something that I'm comfortable doing and want to get done and look nice, I'll do line art for it, and then I will lay down the flats under the line art, and then do the shadow all in one color, usually like a pink or a purple, like a fairly dark pink or purple, then put that as usually a soft light, sometimes a hard light, overlay layer, and then do the highlights in a yellow color as a soft light or overlay layer. So actually going in and painting the different aspects here is a bit different than what I would normally do, but I think it benefits this particular piece. I felt like, I guess, having the skin be softer, having the image be softer, was of more importance to me. Oh man, I had a lot of trouble with those eyes. You'll see that I had a lot of trouble sort of figuring out what I wanted to do with the eye makeup, or the eyelash makeup specifically. Like, I definitely liked that shape, but I just didn't really know how much lash I wanted to have. Because Lolita makeup can vary pretty wildly. There's some that are very Japanese inspired, so it's very much like Japanese, fashionable Japanese makeup, or more exaggerated styles of popular Japanese makeup. There are some Lolitas use like almost very exaggerated, overly feminine, almost a drag-like makeup. Some go for extremely subtle makeup, where there's very little. The shades tend to be very neutral. The colors, everything tends to just be to support the fashion, to support the coordinate, as opposed to stand out as face makeup. For this, obviously I went for a more bold look, because I feel like for the style that I was going for, the eye makeup would have to be bold. Vaporwave is not really a subtle it's not really a subtle makeup style, or it's not a subtle aesthetic. And again, I don't normally really do much in the way of like eye makeup on the characters that I draw or the paintings that I work on. I'm no good at doing makeup on myself, so I really don't know how to do it on a illustration either.
would you like to retire in 10 to 15 years and still have a perpetual stream of income flowing your way?
Desire without sex. Night Vision Forever presents its newest brand activation, Suburban Temples. Exclusively from Water Features.
So I didn't end up really getting any footage of me creating the background. The background was pretty... Once I figured out what I wanted to do with it, it was pretty straightforward of just importing the MS Paint window file that I wanted to use, creating a good gradient to go behind it, making sure all the textures worked out. Lost the footage of that, but don't worry, you're not really missing out with me creating the background. So this is the finished image, the finished illustration. Let me know what you think of it. Let me know if you want to see any more illustrations that are done in this same style, this sort of incorporation of very modern, very futurist vaporwave aesthetics to a Lolita shape or a more traditional Lolita style. Let me know if you want to see me maybe do a more traditional look, illustrate a more traditional Lolita look. I'll definitely be coming back with some more illustrations. Maybe some more, hopefully... I'll definitely be coming back with some more illustrations. Maybe not Lolita related, or maybe not Vaporwave related, but I hope you'll like it nonetheless. I hope to see you again. All right.